when my grandson Owen leaned in at the playground and whispered, "Grandpa, Mommy says I can't see you without your cards." He was referring to the grocery cards, the gas card, those small prepaid envelopes I tucked into birthday bags, mistaking my attempts at help as genuine love. To shield him from my pain, I pushed the swing one more time, desperate to keep my hands from shaking. Please subscribe and like the video to share more stories like this. When I was a child, love was the tap of my mother's wristwatch against the Formica countertop, her palm cradling the warmth of my forehead after a nightmare, the staccato code of parental devotion. When I was a father, love became quieter, a series of bank statements, the shimmer of birthday candles, permission slips inked in triplicate before dawn. As a grandfather, love condensed to the sticky residue of half-priced ice cream and the gentle labor of shoveling snow from 3 steps at a rented duplex, though my daughter's household boasted 3 able-bodied men. None of this prepared me for what Owen said at exactly 4:26 p.m. on a Sunday in May, when the air smelled like dandelion fluff and the playground mulch gave off the tang of sun-warmed resin. He was light for his age, and when I caught him mid-arc, I could still lift him higher than any of the other children's grandparents could manage. I savored this, the illusion of strength, the artifact of time reversed, and had begun the mental calculus of how many years remained before Owen overtook me in height and velocity. There were always fewer than I wished. "Again, Grandpa," he shouted, legs pinwheeling, shoes flashing phosphorescent green with each kick. "1, 2, and up!" My voice rasped the syllables, and I clung to the rhythmic certainty of numbers. Each swing a metronome, each arc a promise that repetition could make anything eternal. After 24 swings, yes, I counted, because numbers never lie, I let the tire slow its spiral and stepped in for the hug Owen always gave when he needed a breather, sweaty and unguarded. He pressed his face to my shirt, breathing in a way that I pretended was affection rather than oxygen deficit. For a moment he rested there, a soft pulse against my ribs. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, he said, "Grandpa, Mommy says I can't see you without your cards." I stood there, arms frozen in a pantomime of embrace, unable to release or tighten. "What cards, Owen?" I asked, as if the 2 syllables didn't already lacerate. He shrugged, burrowing deeper. "The ones in the envelopes. The cards you bring. Mommy says that's how you love us. She said you have to." The playground was not loud, just the irregular shrieks and giggles of children orbiting slides and ladders. But the sentence detonated in my chest, a charge I'd been laying for years without knowing. Owen's hands, so small, clung to me not out of need, but out of habit. The transactional nature of it pressed against me like the edge of a paper cut. Shallow, invisible, but persistent. I found my voice again and forced a brightness I did not feel. "Did you know, Owen, that swings go higher if you kick at just the right time?" I lifted him onto the blue plastic saddle, hands trembling so violently that I steadied myself with a deep breath, afraid he'd notice. He giggled, already forgetting, or at least refusing to hold, the heaviness he'd just delivered. "Show me," he commanded, and I did. There is a way to hide the shake in your hands if you keep them moving. I pushed the swing, set my rhythm, and tried to recall the exact years I had conflated love with provision. Was it the first time I slipped a gas card into a Christmas envelope, congratulating myself on forethought? Or was it when I co-signed the loan for their minivan, rationalizing that families are meant to help one another? I'd always believed I was doing good. Owen's mother, Lena, had not lacked for affection, but she had learned early that affection could be indexed, compounded, and drawn against like a pension. The swings blurred, and for a second I allowed myself the fantasy that Owen was a younger Lena, and I was a father again. not yet so wounded by the slow grind of ATM withdrawals and unsaid expectations. But the words, "can't see you without your cards," anchored me to the present. I watched the other parents and caregivers, none of them aware that a legacy could rot from the inside out, one prepaid envelope at a time. Owen laughed. A bright peal, and the world recalibrated itself. He shouted something about the moon and how he would swing there if I pushed hard enough. I wondered if he would remember this afternoon in any detail, or if it would become just another amalgamated childhood memory, one that wouldn't specify the desperate clutch of my hands or the breath I held for fear of shattering both of us. I checked my watch. 4:27 p.m. 1 minute later, already older, none the wiser. I wiped the sweat from Owen's brow and said, "You're going to go higher than anyone, kiddo." "Just you watch." He cheered, face red and happy, and for a fleeting moment I managed to believe it. On the walk home, Owen skipped beside me, still talking about moon landings and swings, the harsh words already abandoned like a dropped mitten. I tried not to count the steps or tally the seconds, but failed, as always. When we reached the front door, I knelt to tie his untied shoe. His laces were frayed, and I wondered if Lena would accept a new pair, or if it would be another entry on the ledger she was quietly keeping against me. He hugged me, not out of obligation, but because 7-year-olds don't know any other way. "Thanks, Grandpa," he said. "Anytime, Owen," I replied, voice sanded down to its barest edge. I watched him run inside, the screen door slamming like a punctuation mark. Only when he disappeared did I let myself feel the totality of what he'd said, the sorrow of a man whose best intentions had fossilized into expectation, the ache of knowing I had never once given freely enough to be remembered for generosity alone. I stood on the porch, wind lifting my thinning hair, and stared at my hands. They had steadied swings and held sick loved ones, and yes, they had signed checks, but it was the smallest hand, the one that had clutched my finger not 20 minutes ago, that undid me. For the first time in 70 years, I wondered if it was possible to love in any other way. For decades, I lived by the axiom that anything worth loving was worth sacrificing for, and the only real currency in a man's ledger was pain spent quietly. I spent mine in the seams of every morning, siphoning the first hour's chill from my bed so the rest of the house would wake to warmth, even in the years after Lena had left for college and my wife, Ruth, slept too light to notice the difference. When I lost the last of my hearing in my left ear, it was from the chronic hum of compressors and the pre-dawn clatter of industrial ice machines at the bottling plant, where the foreman said I was the only man in the county who would pull a double on holidays. I did not buy myself Christmas presents or shoes that cost more than a Jackson, but I sent Ruth and Lena on a cruise to Cozumel when the only water I saw was what collected at the bottom of the evaporator pit. I set aside the taste for scotch because Ruth's medication made her queasy at the smell, and I pretended to enjoy lukewarm generic beer at neighborhood barbecues, though the men would always tip their bottles to me in a way that said they noticed. There were birthdays I missed, violin recitals I watched from the back row still wearing my name patch, the polyester shirt a salt lick from the 12-hour shift. For Lena's braces, I sold my bicycle, then my prized set of stereo speakers, the ones I bought after high school when I still believed music could drown out anything. When Lena's first husband crashed his Ford during a February ice storm, I co-signed the note for a Subaru, even though I'd always loathed the shape of that car. When the apartment's furnace went, I wired $300 overnight and never told Ruth, who would have only worried or worse offered to take on another shift herself. I kept these things private, chronicling them in mental ledgers whose only auditor was my own conscience. Love, I thought, was a function of subtraction. You gave until it hurt, then you gave a little more, so the ones you loved could keep their margins intact. Every time I saw Ruth sitting up in her robe, pencil in hand, and reading the home care instructions from the hospital, tracing the words with a reverence that verged on superstition, I felt the weight of my duty settle deeper into my bones. The waiting rooms were where I perfected the art of patience. I learned every variation of bad coffee, over-extracted, metallic, brackish, and found comfort in the ritual of sipping it from styrofoam. While Ruth was poked and scanned, I folded cranes from discharge paperwork, lined them up along the window ledge, and watched the city's skyline dissolve into dusk. Some days I thought I could smell the ozone from the electrical storms in the walls, or sense the subtle way time swelled and contracted inside a hospital, as if the very air thickened with every new diagnosis. When Ruth went, it was the only bill I had not anticipated. There was no overtime that could balance that ledger, no loan to co-sign, no card to load and present with a flourish of grandparental largesse. There was only the sound of the refrigerator humming at 2 a.m., and the feeling that the world was a machine designed to measure the distance between intentions and their results. Even after, I kept the habit of provisioning. Lena, newly a mother herself, moved from one rental to another, each time a little farther from my zip code. She never asked for help directly, but she had inherited my inclination toward indirect speech. The way she'd mention a leaky faucet or a sky-high utility bill, then change the subject with a forced laugh. I responded in kind. I fixed faucets and paid bills, sometimes anonymously, sometimes with a note that only said, "Stay warm," or "Let me know if it's enough." On the birthdays when I saw Owen, he wore a new coat or opened a toy still smelling of the warehouse, and I would watch Lena's eyes for any flicker of resentment. There never was. But neither was there any gratitude. And I told myself this was the way things ought to be, that love, once deposited, was never supposed to accrue interest. Yet every card I slipped into an envelope, every prepaid gift, became both a promise and a quiet plea. Notice me. Forgive the absences. Let this be enough. In the silences after Owen's words at the playground, I inventoried the years I'd spent mortgaging my life for their comfort. The arithmetic was merciless. There was no principle left, only the small change of habit and the exhausted machinery of a body that had long ago stopped belonging to itself. I made a sandwich for dinner and ate it in the den, the old radio playing a news broadcast I wasn't listening to. The room was dark, the only light a lamp with its shade cracked from a decade of careless bumps. I let the sandwich sit half-eaten while I traced the grooves on the side table where Ruth once kept her sewing kit. In the quiet, I heard the echo of Owen's words again. "Can't see you without your cards." I wondered how many more years I would have with him before the swings were too small, before the only memory he'd have of me would be the bills I'd paid or the gifts I'd brought. I wondered if Ruth would have been proud of the ledger I'd kept, or if she'd have scolded me for mistaking love for the sum of its costs. I finished the sandwich, chewing slowly, and when I stood, my knees complained the way they always did after a full day. But I made myself walk to the kitchen and rinse the plate, to leave the room as I'd found it, to at least make a show of self-respect, if not self-love. When I climbed into bed, I set my alarm for 5:55 a.m., even though there was nowhere I needed to be. Some habits are the only inheritance worth leaving. The phrase "without your cards" was a code, a cipher that unraveled everything I had built with sweat and carefulness and sleepless nights. The words stalked me all the way home, shadowing the click of Owen's sneaker heels as they struck the uneven sidewalk. I walked a step behind, studying the back of his head, the unmanageable cowlick that poked up despite Lena's attempts at discipline. He sang to himself in a thin, contented voice, a song about astronauts, oblivious to the seismic shift in the old man beside him. Each breath I took was deliberate, the effort of it punctuating my ribs with the memory of his soft-spoken sabotage. Love was a toll booth. The price of passage, a grocery card, a 20 slipped into a birthday card. a gas station receipt crisp from the register. The realization hollowed me out. I wanted to ask Owen what else his mother said about me, if there were other currencies I hadn't yet discovered, but I stopped myself. The interrogation would only make me a debtor, and I had already spent too many years indebted to the whims of people I loved. When we reached Lena's townhouse, I watched the window for a glimpse of her, a signal that she was watching, judging my performance as grandfather. None came. Owen hugged me at the stoop, a perfunctory squeeze, and dashed inside. I lingered on the porch for a full minute, inventorying the cracks in the concrete, the uneven spacing of the address numbers, the faint whiff of cigarette smoke from the neighboring unit. Details I could quantify, things I could fix if only I were allowed. My own house welcomed me with its staleness, the familiar embrace of silence. The kitchen was brighter than I liked, the setting sun igniting a mosaic of crumbs I had failed to wipe from the countertop. I sat heavily at the table and pulled the yellow legal pad toward me, its pages already scrawled with lists. Groceries, errands, appointments, reminders to call the dentist or refill Ruth's old prescriptions. I tore off a fresh sheet and wrote, in block capitals, Owen, May 7th, 4:26 p.m. Without your cards, the words looked foreign on paper. An incantation gone wrong. I underlined it then, because the compulsion was stronger than my sense of dignity, began to tally every card, every transfer, every envelope that had left my hands in the past 90 days. $40 Visa for Easter, $25. Target for birthday, $10. McDonald's, twice. March, April. $30 gas for Lena, March 23rd. $250 direct transfer, April 15th, car trouble. The total grew quickly, a sum larger than I had expected, and I found myself cross-referencing my bank statements to verify the numbers. I copied each line with mechanical precision, imagining the audit to come, the trial in some unseen court of familial law. When I finished, I sat back and read the list, tracing the indentation of each digit with my finger, as if the act of touching them could somehow lessen their significance. Then I went to the sideboard, where I kept the loose envelopes, some stamped, some merely addressed, all kept as proof against the suspicion that I'd forgotten anyone. I lined them up in a row on the table, the names facing outward. Lena, Chris, Owen. I counted the blank ones, the ones I'd meant to use for future holidays, and realized I had bought them in bulk, as if preparing for years of atonement in advance. The visual effect was dismal. The kitchen table, once the site of Sunday pancakes and Ruth's crossword puzzles, now resembled a banker's desk at the close of fiscal year. The envelopes stared back at me, mute witnesses to my folly, each one a monument to the idea that affection could be prepaid. I tried to imagine what Ruth would say. I could almost hear her voice, wry, affectionate, but unflinching. "You can't spend your way out of loneliness, Stanley," she would say. "You'll just go broke trying." I arranged the envelopes in order of amount, then by date, and finally by recipient. The obsessive sorting calmed me, gave my hands a purpose, kept them from trembling. But when I stepped back, I saw what I had done. Built a ledger out of love, reduced a lifetime of devotion to a sequence of transactions. I felt shame curdle in my stomach, a slow, fermenting ache. There were other debts, too, ones I had never written down, the years I'd missed, the calls not made, the arguments I let fester rather than face. I had always believed that covering the practical needs would compensate for my emotional deficits, that a child or grandchild, when given enough, would overlook the rest. Now I saw that every dollar spent was a silent confession of guilt, an IOU for what I could never articulate. The list on the yellow pad stared up at me, a testament to all I had tried and failed to accomplish. I left it there, alongside the neat row of envelopes, and went to the living room. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the old recliner and let the darkness gather around me. The only illumination, a shaft of sun that angled across the carpet, picking out every threadbare patch. I thought of Owen's words, his face pressed against my side, and wondered what would happen if I stopped paying. Would the calls end? Would the visits disappear? Would I finally be free to love without the expectation of recompense? Or would I simply fade into irrelevance, a ghost with nothing left to offer? The evening deepened, the air inside the house cooling, and I let the question hang unanswered. Tomorrow, I decided, I would begin keeping a different kind of record, one that didn't require proof or payment, if I could figure out how. At 9:05 a.m. sharp, I parked in the shaded corner of the Riverbank Credit Union lot, angled as far from the front door as possible. I needed the extra steps, the time to rehearse the speech I had written the night before on a card I kept folded in my breast pocket, next to the stub of Ruth's favorite mechanical pencil. The air was still chilly, but the sun was ruthless, bouncing off the glass and metal, so that the whole place glared with an aggression I found oddly comforting. At least here, everything was stated plainly. Inside, the branch had that disinfected calm, the faintest ghost of Lysol layered over the smell of fresh bills and toner. The manager was a young woman, probably 20 years younger than Lena, who greeted me by name. I wondered what she thought of the old man who wore a button-down even on days off, and always insisted on getting receipts for every transaction. "Good morning, Mr. Ward," she said, polite but brisk. "How can we help you today?" I unfolded the yellow pad, now dog-eared and annotated with corrections. The list was precise. Every recurring transfer, every standing reload, every potential leak in the system that made me an ATM for anyone with a clever enough story. I handed it across the desk with both hands, like a fragile relic. "I need to freeze all auto-reloads on these accounts," I said, the words trembling just a little. "And I want a transfer cap. No changes unless I'm here. In person." She nodded, businesslike. "Is there a specific limit you'd like to set, or—" "0," I said, surprising myself. "Let's make it 0. The woman glanced at me, eyebrows flickering. For a moment I thought she might say something about family, or how most people just set a password and call it a day. But she only clicked her keyboard. Efficient, no nonsense. "We can also require an in-person password for all changes. Do you have one in mind?" I did, though it felt embarrassing to say it aloud. "Bluebird," I said. Ruth's favorite color, and the name of the music venue where we'd met. "Bluebird," she repeated, typing it with careful accuracy. We went through the list, item by item. She read back the changes, and I signed the necessary forms with deliberate strokes, making sure every signature matched the one on file. When she finished, she slid a slim folder across the desk, its cover an impossible shade of blue, exactly the hue of the Crayola Ruth always used for Sky and Owen's drawings. "These are your confirmations, Mr. Ward," she said. "If you have any questions, just let us know." I opened the folder and ran a thumb over the glossy surface. I felt the urge to tell her about Owen, about Lena, about the weight of cards and expectation, but I kept silent. This was not her ledger to reconcile. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. As I walked out, the folder tucked under my arm, I felt an odd lightness, fragile, easily lost, but real enough to notice. The world outside looked the same, but I was newly invisible. There would be phone calls, I knew, and questions, and maybe even a confrontation. But for the moment, I had closed a chapter. I had made a boundary, and for the first time in my life, it felt like an act of love. For myself. I walked the long way back to the car, relishing the feel of the folder against my ribs. the blue vivid against my white shirt. In the reflection of the car window, I looked older than ever, but I also looked, just briefly, at ease. I climbed in, set the folder on the passenger seat, and whispered the password once, just to myself. Bluebird. It was enough for now. Subscribe and share one line you wish you'd heard earlier. Someone will borrow it. At 1:30 p.m. sharp, I sat across a low, slate-colored desk from a man whose tie bore the logo of a state university I had never visited. The office was small but intentionally homey. The walls hung with watercolor prints of birds and rivers, all calculated to reassure. I could smell coffee, faintly burnt, and the loamy scent of dust trapped in the corduroy of old furniture. The attorney's name was Miles Ortega, and he was at least a decade younger than Lena, with the kind of calm that made me feel both ancient and slightly dangerous, as if I were a loose electrical wire someone had forgotten to tape down. He began by shaking my hand, briefly, then pulling out a legal pad of his own, blue ink already loaded. "You're here about establishing boundaries," he said. Not a question, but a thesis. I nodded, feeling the heat rise in my ears. "Tell me in your own words," he prompted, pen poised. I tried to. I recited, as I had in the car, the catalog of prepaid cards, the incremental whittling away of dignity. The moment Owen relayed his mother's words with the innocence of a broadcast signal. Miles listened without interruption, though occasionally he would scribble something, the pen skating silently over the paper. When I finished, he pushed his glasses up and said, "That's elder exploitation, Mr. Ward. Most people assume it only happens with strangers." "Feels shameful to call it that," I admitted. He smiled, kindly but without much pity. "Shame is what keeps it going. Most of my clients don't realize there's even a word for it." He turned to his laptop and began drafting. I watched the cursor move, the rapid staccato of keys, and imagined a future in which my grandchildren could not be held hostage by the cost of a happy birthday. It was uncharted territory. Every word felt both weaponized and terrifyingly final. Miles read the letter aloud, each clause crisp as a gavel. "This correspondence serves to notify Lena Ward and Chris Reynolds that further visitation between Stanley Ward and minor grandchild Owen Ward shall not be conditioned upon provision of financial gifts, prepaid cards, or other forms of monetary compensation. Any such request or suggestion will be considered evidence of coercion and subject to documentation. Effective immediately, supervised visits will be arranged at the community center with oversight from a neutral third party. A family therapist will be retained to assess the best interests of the child." He looked up. "We can soften it if you want, but I recommend keeping it direct." I sat with the words, feeling the tectonic shift in their gravity. "Keep it," I said, surprising both of us. He nodded. "I'll send a copy to them and one to you. For now, record every conversation. Use your phone just in case. If they retaliate or try to bypass the cap at the bank, call me." He offered a business card. I took it, the weight of cardstock heavier than it should have been. "What happens if Owen asks about it?" I asked, voice barely audible. "You say, 'I love you, and I always want to see you.' Sometimes grown-ups need help remembering what matters. That's all. Let paper carry the weight." He smiled, an incantation. The appointment ended with a handshake, and I left the office with a sheaf of copies in a manila envelope. I tucked them into the blue folder next to the bank documents and sat in the car for a long time. The world outside was unchanged, suburban, slightly wilted, strip malls baking in the sun. But something in me had shifted. There would be calls, there would be anger, and maybe threats. I would miss the small rituals, the impromptu stops at Target, or the way Owen lit up at a Happy Meal. But I felt a strange, stubborn pride, the kind that only comes after years of capitulation. I was no longer an ATM. I was a grandfather, and I would be damned if I let anyone else define that. I drove home slow, taking the scenic route along the river, watching the herons pick their way through the shallows. The world was indifferent, but for the first time in years, I felt seen. Not by family or neighbors, but by the unblinking eye of a principle I'd never thought to invoke. Let paper carry the weight, I repeated, tasting the words like a new and slightly bitter medicine. I suspected it would not go down easy, but I swallowed it anyway. On Wednesday afternoon, just past 3, an email arrived confirming the new visitation protocol. Sunday, 2 p.m., 1-hour slot. Staff present at all times. No money or gifts allowed on the premises. The formality of it, every phrase inked in legalese and stamped with the logo of the community center, unsettled me. I read the email 3 times, each time feeling less like a grandfather and more like a litigant in a child custody dispute. That night, the sky threatened rain but couldn't quite deliver, only spitting a fine mist that made the streetlights blur into soft halos. I made tea, though I hated the taste, and laid out the blue folder, the manila envelope, and the stack of new, blank cards that I kept for no reason other than habit. I set my phone to voice memo and placed it inconspicuously between the sugar bowl and the creamer. I called Lena and asked her to bring Chris after dinner. When they arrived, the tension was immediate, as if the air had been vacuum-sealed in anticipation. Lena wore a blazer, more formal than I'd ever seen her at home, and Chris's eyes darted between my face and the folder like a man watching for the next move in a chess match. They sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same spot where Ruth had once mediated every family argument with a baked good and a story from her own hard childhood. I cleared my throat. Thank you for coming. There are a few things I need to say, and I'd appreciate if you let me finish before responding. Lena nodded, jaw set. Chris clasped his hands on the tabletop, knuckles pale. I've made some changes, I began, gesturing to the blue folder. Starting now, there will be no more automatic transfers, no reloads, no cash gifts. If Owen needs something, you'll tell me directly, and we'll talk about it. If you want to see me, you can, no strings attached. That's how it should have been all along. Lena's mouth opened, then closed. Chris looked down at his hands. There's a letter from an attorney in here, I said. It's just to make it official. Not a threat, but a boundary. For all of us. The silence stretched. I let it. Years of being the silent one in arguments had taught me that whoever spoke first was usually the weaker party. Finally, Chris said, voice trembling, "We just needed help this month." The car? I shook my head, not unkindly. I've helped for years, Chris. I want to help, but I can't be a toll booth for my own grandson. My voice softened. I miss him when he's not here. I don't want him to think love costs money. Lena looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the glimmer of something ancient and sorrowful in her eyes. Maybe she remembered the birthday parties, the way I'd work through the night to build her a dollhouse or a tree swing, the afternoons we'd spent together before the world taught her that everything was transactional. Or maybe she saw only the ledger, the entries and exits, the years when I'd hidden behind pay stubs instead of words. On the table, between us, I slid an empty envelope. It was the gesture that gutted me. The suggestion that if they wanted to, they could still take something. That old habits didn't die but lingered, even in the face of principle. But before they could touch it, I pulled it back to my side. The motion was quiet, almost tender, but final. We'll do the visits at the center, if that's what you want, Lena said, after a long moment. But this isn't fair to Owen. Maybe not, I agreed. But it's the only way I know how to break the cycle. She nodded once, sharply. Chris's shoulders sagged, defeated. They stood, and for a heartbeat I wondered if this was the last time I would ever see either of them outside a monitored setting. But as they turned to go, Lena hesitated. She looked back at me, her expression unreadable, and for the first time since Ruth's funeral, I felt the heat of tears behind my eyes. "Thank you for dinner," she said, out of nowhere. Then they left, the door closing with a hush of rubber gasket. I sat at the table for a long time after, the envelope resting beneath my palm, the blue folder a wedge of sky on the tabletop. I replayed the conversation on the voice memo, not for evidence, but to hear the sound of my own resolve. It was thin, wavering, but there. I poured the tea down the sink and went to bed early, knowing I would need all my strength for Sunday. For the first time in months, I slept without dreaming of numbers. By Friday, Riverbank had confirmed via registered letter that all reloads, transfers, and payment authorizations linked to my account were terminated. My profile flagged for in-branch changes only. The wording was almost comically final. No electronic exceptions will be made without verified signature and password. I placed the letter in the blue folder next to the printouts from the attorney and the new schedule from the community center. That afternoon, an email pinged in from Miles. He had forwarded Chris's reply, terse but unmistakable in its concession. "We acknowledge your new visitation plan and will comply. No gifts or transfers requested. Owen is excited to see you Sunday. No apology, but also no threats." I read the line twice, searching for a loophole, but found none. I allowed myself a cautious relief. I gathered all the documentation, every slip of paper and notarized stamp, and placed them in the small fire safe that Ruth had always insisted on keeping under the guest room bed. It smelled faintly of metal and old newsprint, the inside lined with a cheap velvet that left blue dust on my fingers. I closed the safe with a finality that felt almost ceremonial. I taped the community center's address and visit time inside the front door, just in case. I did not trust memory, but I could trust tape. On Saturday morning, I walked to the library and found the children's section empty, but for a mother with twin toddlers and a librarian reading quietly to herself. I scanned the shelves for something about rockets, remembering Owen's obsession with the Saturn V and the crayon murals he'd once made on Lena's hallway walls. I selected a hardback with bright illustrations and a fold-out diagram of the lunar module and tucked it into my bag. At home, I laid out my clothes for the next day, checked the folder again, and wrote, "Owen visit, 2 p.m. in black marker on the fridge." I wanted to be prepared, wanted every contingency accounted for, though I suspected the worst of it was behind me. That night, I made a real dinner, meatloaf, potatoes, peas from the freezer, and ate at the table with the folder and the rocket book beside me. I watched the evening news, which was all static and reruns, then turned off the TV and sat in the quiet, waiting for sleep. It didn't come easily, but when it did, it was dreamless. Sunday at 1:54 p.m., I pulled into the parking lot behind the community center. The sky was April blue, sickeningly cheerful, the kind of day that made you wonder if you'd ever earned any of it. The building was low and cinder block, ringed by puddles that reflected the stained glass colors of the playground equipment outside. I sat in the car and watched the minute hand crawl toward the top of the hour. When it was time, I got out, locked the folder and the book in the trunk, and went in with nothing in my pockets but my phone and a handkerchief. Inside, the smell of pencil shavings and mop water was so strong it nearly stung. At the front desk, a young woman with a clipboard looked up and said, "Ward? Supervised visit?" I nodded. "Yes, Stanley." She checked my name off, then pointed me to a door at the end of the hallway where a sign read multi-purpose room. I had a mental image of Ruth making fun of the way every public space had become multi-purpose, as if the world was always expecting to pivot at a moment's notice. Owen was waiting for me, feet swinging from a plastic chair. When he saw me, he grinned so wide I could count every gap in his teeth. He wore a shirt with a faded moon landing on it, and his hair was even more untamable than last week. For a split second, I wondered what Lena and Chris had told him about the new arrangement. But he ran to me and threw his arms around my waist before I could think further. I knelt down and hugged him back, surprised by the surge of relief. "Hey, astronaut," I said. "Ready for blastoff?" He nodded. "I want to build a rocket. A real one this time, not a baby one." There was a table in the corner set up with construction paper, scissors, and glue sticks. Some volunteer or staffer had anticipated the demand. We walked over and got to work, Owen chattering the entire time about the planets and the fuel requirements of Saturn V. He said liquid oxygen with such authority I almost laughed. We folded and cut, rolled paper into cones, and taped on cardboard fins. I helped only when asked, watching his fingers navigate the tricky bits with a dexterity I envied. The rocket was a mess, glue smeared everywhere, one fin slightly off kilter. But when we set it on the table and counted down from 10, Owen's face lit up as if we'd just launched the real thing. We tried to make it fly, but it toppled, skidding across the table and breaking a fin. Owen howled with laughter. "Next time we'll use real engines," he said, and I promised we would. A staffer brought us apple juice and graham crackers. Owen dunked his crackers and told me about a new friend at school who could burp the alphabet. The hour vanished, as hours do when you know exactly how many you have left. I watched the clock, but not compulsively, letting the minutes pool in the margins. When the visit was almost over, Owen leaned close and whispered, "Can you come next week, Grandpa? Even if it's not a holiday?" "I'll be here every week," I said. "Every single one they let me." He hugged me again, then looked up. "Are we still a team?" "Always," I said. The volunteer called time. I gathered the paper rocket, now battered and flecked with dried glue, and handed it to Owen. He clutched it to his chest like a trophy. He walked out with the staffer, not looking back, as if confident the next visit would simply happen. For him, maybe it would. The multipurpose room emptied, the echo of Owen's laughter lingering in the institutional stillness. I sat for a moment, letting the feeling settle. The folder in the trunk contained all my defenses, but here, now, I needed none of it. I was just a grandfather, released from the burden of proof. Justice, I realized, was not the point. It was not about payback or reparations, not about balancing the old accounts. Justice was a calendar square on a cheap community center handout, a password spoken at a teller window, a clipboard rule that said no gifts, and meant it. I drove home slow, the rocket book still in my bag. At a stoplight, I caught sight of myself in the rear view. Older, certainly, but not defeated. In the house, I hung up my jacket, reheated leftover meatloaf, and oversalted it without apology. I set the next visit time in my phone, not because I needed a reminder, but because I liked the certainty. I thought about Ruth, about how she would have laughed at my earlier idea of love, a love that had to be bought, secured, and signed for. She would have told me that the best things in life were returnable, reusable, shared out in little acts and gentle absurdities. She would have been proud of the way Owen and I built something out of paper and glue, then laughed when it crashed. That night, I misplaced my glasses 3 times, and each time I found them, I thought about the things that come back to you if you're patient. When I went to bed, the house was still, the kitchen table cleared of ledgers and receipts. I dreamed of rockets, bright and fragile, flying just far enough to make a child happy, and of hands, mine and Owen's, working together, without any cost at all. Please subscribe and like the video to share more stories like this.